Rosa Colon and Cagen Luse. I want to first go down the line. Everyone can probably introduce themselves better than I can. Take a minute, tell everybody who you are, a little about your work, and specifically what you see as your activism and how that steers your personal work. We'll start with Nate. Sure. This work. Good turn on a little.
Just switch on the Sure, switch on.
Oh, it's already on.
This is fine. Hey y'all, I'm Nate. How's it going? So I write and draw a number of different comics. I guess for the purposes of this panel, as an artist on the March trilogy, giving me a first-hand account of Cagen Luse's experiences as a young person at the center of the civil rights movement, the development and evolution of his experience with organized, disciplined nonviolence, changed the fabric of our country. I guess immediately after the March trilogy, I also collaborated on a comic for the Weather Channel called Waiting a Wave, which had to do with the largest concentration of folks living in America from the Marshall Islands, who are almost entirely concentrated in one town in my home state of Arkansas, who in general have migrated for a number of reasons, but most of those reasons circle around the issue of climate change and rising sea levels in the Marshall Islands, and the generation to generation increasing threats to the elimination of their home island itself. I'd say my other work, especially my fiction work, is much more of sort of a horror, mystery, personal relationship series of narratives, but are sort of unified with March and a lot of my other work. I've been focused on specific subjective experiences and an urgent quest for being taken seriously and for the sovereignty and dignity of people's individual experiences.
That was really impressive. I don't know. Hi, I'm Rosemary Mosco. Can y'all hear me? Okay. All right. I am a nature and science writer and cartoonist. Yeah, you got a barfing Welcher. These days I mostly write science books for kids. But I also have a webcomic called Bird and Moon, and that one focuses a lot on conservation and kind of a mix of making goofy nature jokes to keep people reading, climate change stuff, which is the cause that's most important to me and is a really tough nut to crack in terms of communication. And also kind of practical nature tips, like if a turtle's crossing the road, what do you do? Or are there really cottonmouth snakes in Massachusetts, or that kind of stuff? There are not. So yeah, I kind of like try to attack it from a few different directions. And I also just want people to appreciate and love nature and animals and wildlife.
Hi, my name is Rosa Colon. I am a self-publisher and indie artist from Puerto Rico. I have my own collective with my girlfriend, and we usually do fiction and slice of life. But recently, I started trying to teach myself about the politics on Puerto Rico because it's a really complicated mess, especially with our relationship to the U.S. And I started a little webcomic that I had to interrupt because of the hurricane, and then I started focusing on my comics for the Nib, which talked about the hurricane quite a bit. And basically, what I was trying to do was educate myself and hopefully educate other people who are just as lost as me in my age range, I guess.
Hi, my name is Cagen Luse. I do a weekly comic called Lunchtime Comics, which is kind of biographical, where I get into all sorts of different issues, racism, colorism, sexism, a bunch of other things. I also do a comics enthusiast group for people of color called Comics in Color with my partner, Barrington Edwards, who just snuck in. And that group is just built up a network of comic artists and enthusiasts of color and promote people of color getting into comics and writing comics and expose people of color to other comics by people of color, if that makes sense. And so multiple causes working on now. Yes.
Great, thanks guys. So I just want to kick this off with, this is a question for everybody. I find it personally as a politically minded artist that it's so important to consider the audience way more in a lot of other cases when you're doing other types of work. And who would you say that your work is for? Like, who's your ideal person that you're trying to reach with what you make? I want to start with that.
My comic, I definitely get into what I call a racially ambiguous experience, which is a person who kind of straddles a line between races and gets confused for different things all the time. So that's definitely one of my audience. I mean, when you see the racially ambiguous guidebook, and you get it immediately, my comic is definitely for you. But I think my comic is really for everybody. I really just kind of chronicle the experiences of my family, as a family of color in the United States and the things we deal with. So I think it could be for everybody.
Yeah, amen.
Well, I think my political comics right now are for people in the U.S., and it's a byproduct that people who are Puerto Ricans who are just as lost as me find them informative. But because I think that we kind of get ignored in your guys' news. So I try to explain what's happening to you, but at the same time, I know I'm just as lost as you are, and other people are just as lost as me are. So in the end, it's for everybody, but I'm talking to you guys.
My kids' stuff is for kids, so all kids, hopefully. But my Bird and Moon comics have kind of two different audiences, which can make it kind of tricky. So there are biologists and scientists who kind of read them and feel like, they're not alone, and they can laugh at their study species and kind of like make common. And then also I'm hoping to reach people who are maybe just like a little interested in animals or even just in silly jokes, and then I can hook them with that and then kind of sneak in the climate change stuff on the side. So it's kind of two different ones, so it can be tricky.
I'd say prior to the publication of March Book 1, I almost drew a line in the sand where I never wanted to consider the potential readership of anybody as they would encounter my books. So prior to that, as an adult, I was making books for myself. And so I was expecting that it was largely adults and young adults. Or older teenagers or whatever. Also, I'm from the South, and I had enough of a basic working knowledge through my parents and through my upbringing of key moments through civil rights history that I had almost finished. I was a little over halfway done with March Book 1 before I realized that I was taking for granted a lot of basic components in the chronology of the history of the civil rights movement. Once Andrew Iden kind of pointed out to me that, in fact, I was 37 or 35 or however old I was at the time, and that there were 15-year-olds, there were 10-year-olds who grew up in a very different world, who, it cannot be taken for granted, that you need 2 or 2.5 pages to lay out Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. Things like that I just really, I was like, oh, this is a no-brainer. That sort of forced me to go back and reevaluate not just how the content of March was being portrayed, but for the first time forced me to understand that there were specific cross-sections of people reading March with an intergenerational experience that I had never even bothered to see. Like they were like in a fog, an intergenerational fog. So without trying to tailor it to younger people at all, like one of the challenges there was this balance where all of us collectively knew that we weren't going to omit or whittle down any component of the history contained, but we knew that we had to be able to execute things in a fashion so that, 12-year-olds were able to process things in the same way that 20-year-olds and 70-year-olds were able to. And I'd say coming out of that and coming out of March, the work that I make now sort of passed through the threshold where I feel like I'm a little more conscientious as a creator, understanding that it's not magic that people find your book and read it. There's a process, there are gatekeepers and librarians and teachers and bookstore people. And so now I feel like a lot of it has to do with listening to those voices as I'm making something to figure out whose hands those stories might wind up in. And then other weird stuff like the Weather Channel comic. It's funny because the goal, I guess, is for mostly people who don't read comics to read that as a work of journalism and kind of be like, what is this? So it even starts with the disclaimer, this is a work of journalism. Just put it right out there.
Yeah, we've all run into that, I think, especially with a lot of these serious issues. Have you guys? This actually reminds me of something. Have you guys ever run into any problem when you're talking to somebody for a piece that they don't take it seriously because it's a comic? Because that is something we've run into fairly often as a publication. With the Nib, is you'll be talking to someone, trying to interview someone, and you need to explain to them that comics, with Bang Zoom, they're not just for kids anymore. That's a thing that a lot of people still don't. As much as we make fun of that sort of article being rewritten every 30 seconds, it's still a thing that happens kind of a lot, where someone will pull out of something when they realize it's a comic, or they'll see that it's a comic. Has ever happened to you guys? And how do you approach communicating to a subject? Anybody?
I haven't approached that as much as people don't value the comics, where they'll ask for a project and you'll say, oh, well, it costs X amount. And they're like, I don't want to pay that much for a comic. That's more what I've experienced.
Yeah.
I think I had the opposite experience because back home, everybody knows me and they know our comics. But then when we started doing the comics for the Nib, a lot of Nib fans came out of the closet, so to say, oh my God, I can't believe you're on the Nib! I can't believe you're on the Nib! And they got really excited about that because they got really pumped that they were reading a story about themselves on this really popular website.
That's nice.
I feel like I've done a lot of work where I pair up with a scientist. Some scientists I'll say, oh, can I make a comic about your work? And it's not exactly journalism, but they'll say, sure. And then I'll do it and they'll be like, great. And they're just like, why would you do this? And then they'll be like, wait, people are emailing me about this thing. I don't understand. But other scientists are really, really, really excited and they really get it. And there's a whole SciComm, science communication world that just gets it and is amazing and inspiring and makes Twitter a happy place for me. I do find the kid thing is interesting because I have this little collection of my comics called Birding is My Favorite Video Game, and people always say, oh, that looks nice, I'm getting it for my kids. And I'm really happy because, kids are amazing and they can totally read this book, but I was thinking about adults when I wrote it. So it does make me a little sad that people look at it and they're like, oh, it's colorful and cute and by women, so it must be for children. And oh no, but the research is real. It should be for everybody. So I feel like that's always kind of a challenge too. And it gets filed in very strange places in bookstores. So.
I think specific to March. Because, we really didn't have a solid concept of what the potential scope or scale of it could be, I think, until it actually rolled out and people started coming up to us who had read the book, or daring teachers who were that first wave to put it in their classrooms. But to me, one of the shockers, it's not a big surprise, but it took somebody actually saying oh, I'm a history teacher, I teach this in my history class. And all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, I always think about English teachers, they're like, oh, I'm taking a chance on this graphic novel. And I was like, wait a minute, this is history. But how do you keep a history book in history classes? We're already walking a tight line, and some of these trailblazers are taking a risk by having this comic in their history class. regardless of the content, which is also ripe for certain parties to just snatch it out of the classroom. So a lot of that required an immediate crash course as we started book 2 to basically learn what the rules were and what the guidelines were to keep a history book in history class. And that changed our process of creation, our process of fact collecting, ultimately made it a much better trilogy. But in that regard, for us, it makes the first book very different than books 2 and 3. We kind of lucked out. I think there was less documentation and accountability in the first book. It was smaller and more subjective. So we lucked out and were able to learn really fast on the job. But still, like, even after the trilogy was done, it got a review in the New York Times where it was referred to multiple times as a children's book, which was like a borderline almost dangerous thing. Like we were used to having to stand up for this as a memoir and as history and as a and as a comic. But it was really weird to see, even in the upper echelons of book review and publishing gatekeepers, to just not care that there's weight behind misidentifying something like this as a children's book.
To banish you to the children's section of the bookstore, yeah. Great. So this question's for Rosa specifically. You mentioned this before, and I was thinking about it as well, is that the history of Puerto Rico and the current political situation specifically is really, really complex. And I'd say a majority of Americans in the 50 states don't have like a very serious baseline of knowledge coming in for specifically the history of Puerto Ricans and the people that were there pre-Columbus, and then what's everything that's happened since. I mean, you do such a good job of distilling things into these shorter comics, and how do you approach that in your process, like trying to get all this information into something really very understandable and really readable?
Well, for the comic that we did, which one's here? Oh yeah, for the separate comic, that was like a lot of research. So I had to and it was a lot of research of stuff that I hadn't been taught in school because they don't teach about any of this. So a part of the process was talking to my friends and saying, wait, did you know about this? Did you know this happened? And they would go like, yeah, maybe my dad told me or something. I was like, okay, this is important because nobody else. And then I would go and I would find something else and I would go, wait, what? When did this happen? This is like 20 years ago. And talking it out, it helped me like structure the most important things. And then when it got to a period where I remembered when I was a kid, I remember this when I was a kid. So I started talking to myself too, like what did you miss? And like I structured it like that. So that was the most challenging because it was a lot of information.
Yeah. Cool. Rosemary, climate scientists and activists have known this for a really long time, but everyone seems to be getting wise, especially recently with this the climate report that everyone's been talking about, sort of getting wise to the environmental situation that we're in with regards to our doom as a planet. Your comics your comics definitely have less of like a direct call to action approach in regards to what you're advocating for. And I'd like you to speak to the approach and how you came to like sort of getting at the angle at which you approach this stuff is much different than just saying, hey, everybody, we're doomed, call your senator or whatever, which you're not doing at all.
Yeah. So one thing I do is I try to build a social media presence, and then every few posts, if any of you follow me, you'll know I'm like, hey, by the way, maybe you should do this thing. So it's easier to address sometimes posting just straight up. But the comics I've done about it have been really, really hard because I've studied climate communication. There's a lot of thought about how to do it. There's a lot of disagreement about how to do it. Each thing I've made is based on several principles of climate communication, but even then I don't know if any of it's working. So I did a comic recently where I emphasized, that's not, sorry, that's okay.
I don't know.
Turtles are also excellent.
Yeah. Well, this one was it was closer to being a straight up more informative one.
Oh yeah. No, and I worked with a scientist on that, and I learned a lot. I did one that was about the 97-98% scientist what's the word? I don't have the word. Consensus on climate science, and that's even kind of lowballing it. And I used a pie chart because there's literally a paper that says that people respond better to that information if it's in a pie chart than if it's in a different form of stuff. So like I read about it and I try working on it. I think I'm a little hamstrung because like you described climate change as an environmental issue. It's really, for me, it's really a social issue and a poverty issue. It's going to hurt the poor way worse than the rest of us. And so it's really a social justice issue, but I do stuff about birds. And I worry sometimes if I post something about climate change, people will say, oh yeah, I'm worried about the trees. So I try to also talk about human stuff too, but it's
Right.
challenging. I don't think I'm an expert on
Yeah.
that, but I try.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like also a capitalism issue and like a industry issue, certainly. Cool. Cagen, I want to touch on your involvement with Comics in Color, which is a lot of events and panels in the community, along with your very personal work about race and activism. What is it for you about comics that make them an effective tool for driving discussion at the events that you guys hold? Like, what about comics specifically do you think is helpful for engaging with the community like that?
Well, I think, visual storytelling is very universal, and the comics are just a great conduit for conversations. What I love about comics themselves is that anybody can make a comic. Like, you don't need any, expensive equipment or anything. So it's really, anybody can be involved in it. So I think that anybody can see themselves doing it, and therefore I think they can feel involved in comics and the comic making process. And even when we do workshops where people who have never made comics before try making comics and are usually very successful because there's no formula that you have to follow to make comics, which I think is great. So yeah.
Yeah. Nate, in March, you deal with something so specifically that's been sort of rebranded as almost apolitical. People talk about the civil rights movement, and people who would definitely not be on board with it at the time pretend like they would have been, et cetera. And a lot of the hard edges are kind of sanded off. How do you go about, I want to say, correcting the how did you go about correcting the modern perception that the civil rights movement wasn't full of these very extremely radical acts?
Let's say, on one level, it required adjusting my own misconceptions that I grew up with as a Southern kid, and the assumptions that I carried forward. A big turning point, I think, early on, while drawing March, was Andrew introduced me to the SPLC's concept of the 9-word problem, which is that most kids graduate from high school in the U.S. only knowing 9 words about the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. That's it. And that hit the problem. However, I should note that growing up in Arkansas, 8th and 11th grade American history, I didn't get shit about the civil rights movement. I grew up in the same town as, the Little Rock 9 and Little Rock Central High. And a lot of that is because when you're working through history, I remember the second unit, is supposed to go up to whatever, vaguely the present, but I think we made it to about the 1920s by the end of the school year. And the first unit in 8th grade is supposed to go through Reconstruction, and we made it to 1850. So both of the major steps forward in our society, two of the key components were by virtue of the public school system and just the crunch that's on teachers, just never addressed at all. So once I was aware that this was a thing that somebody had a name attached to, that people were paying attention to in terms of this oversight, I'd say the focus changed from book to book. But with book 2 and book 3, I felt like one of the most important issues to tackle, or we felt that one of the most important issues to tackle was to highlight the disproportionate backlash in legislation and violence relative to or compared to relatively modest legal and civil gains from the sit-in movement, the stand-in movement, and to highlight in a tangible, visual way just how imbalanced that backlash was to maintain the status quo, maintain the power structure. In the third book, well, really, in the second book, another major thing was Andrew was really, really focused once he learned more and more about Bayard Rustin, the organizer of the March on Washington, who basically was forced out of the official position by the elders within the movement because he was gay. And during the process leading up to the March on Washington was outed on the Senate floor, I think by Strom Thurmond, in an effort to discredit the civil rights movement and the march as a whole. Realizing that we were incorporating these components into the history, but we were, as long as we weren't looking for who had been swept under the rug by the more convenient, defanged narrative, we were doing a disservice to the entire project. So naturally, within the third book, the Mississippi Freedom Movement and the Selma Movement, these were largely, generally organized and propelled by women within the movement. And so book 3, we knew had to consciously be focused on the efforts of women central to the movements in Alabama and Mississippi. And we were also very focused on disagreement, not just tactical, but philosophical disagreements, which had not yet come to a head in 64 and 65, but focusing more and more on arguments and disagreements behind the scenes, but also the ability of the parties involved to get in these heated debates that had to happen, but also meet back the next day in the streets together in recognition that they still had the same objective. And I feel like that's sort of swinging the pendulum back to counteract a different kind of convenient narrative. And there's really, it's like an onion of like endless layers of convenient and defanged narratives that people don't really like to see that next layer when it deals with movement history. And really, we could have just done that forever.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of something else I've written down, which I want other people to talk about as well, is that, we're all familiar with, like, people on the left love to get in big arguments about tactics. It's like a very common sort of problem. When you're trying to get an explicit point across in a piece of art, how do you, this is for anybody, like how do you decide which parts of the story to show that don't paint people in a good light? Like how do you reconcile that change is enacted by real human beings, like in the March books you mentioned, like we see all this discord within the civil rights movement, and like how do you approach showing that the people that have, the similar objectives and good recognition of what the actual problems are, how do you show them acting badly or disagreeing without sort of undermining yourself? Like, as for anybody, like Rosa, you talk a lot about current Puerto Rico politics, and there's a lot of arguing with people who, they all recognize the same problem, but the outcomes are wildly different.
Yeah, I think I had that problem when I illustrated the faun and the macheteros and stuff like that, because I didn't want to use the word terrorist because it was super loaded and it means something super different now anyway. But I was really aware that Carla's dad, who's a baby boomer, uses that word to describe them, and that my friends who are younger than me use another word like hero and stuff like that. So I was trying to show both sides that these people were nuts, blowing things up, but try to explain why they got to that point. And I also had like a little bit of a balance with the death of Filiberto Ojeda, because it was an assassination, but so you can use to like he got killed or something like that. No, like the FBI kind of assassinated him. So I like try to use those words that kind of paint the picture, but don't necessarily rile up the people who would, but well, he did this. And you would go, yeah, but this is what happened, and then my friends would also think that I was super idealizing them too. So like try to catch a balance so everybody falls into line with the information, because you want them to be informed. You don't want them to react so much, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking that Rosemary also, like there's a lot of consensus about whether or not I mean, there's a lot of consensus over the reality of climate change, but there's certainly, definitely a lot of tactical differences. Like, how do you reconcile that and show that fairly without sort of accidentally discrediting? Because you don't want it to make it look unorganized.
Yeah, and I have really strong opinions, and I try not to. Oh, it's really hard. I'm trying to think. I guess I feel like all of these different voices are really, really important. There's a big argument about whether we should talk about the super dark, doomed narrative, or whether we shouldn't talk about that at all. I guess I feel like this is an issue. The sources of carbon and other gases are numerous, and this is not an issue that we're going to tackle with any one particular approach. We need a variety of approaches. I have my favorite approaches, but I feel like, I don't know, I guess I feel like I try to make it as open and friendly as possible too. I mean, even with this turtles thing, I could start it with many turtles are murdered on the road, and if you murder one, you're a murderer, and like that stuff.
It's not untrue.
Well, yes. Sadly, you won't go to turtle jail with stuff. But so it's really hard because I'm really sensitive and I get really upset. But I try to remember, one, my audience cares, and I can't see that, but I know they do. And two, they probably know some stuff, or they have questions, and I also don't know that. So I try not to condescend. I try to tell them things that I would be interested in hearing, and try to make it useful for me and other people. So I guess I give people the benefit of the doubt, which I have to say, when you say we're doomed, there's this part of me that goes, no, because I really feel like the moment we say we're doomed is the moment we're doomed. There's a really good Rebecca Solnit piece that just came out that's called something like We're Not Doomed. And I read it every day, so you should read it.
That was a little hyperbolic, and I'm sorry.
No, I do the same thing in private.
Yeah, just... So the big question that I have really, but going into this panel, the only thing I really could think about was, as I personally think about this a ton, as someone who does political comics, is can a comic convince anyone of anything? Are we preaching to the choir? Like, what are we doing here? Not to put it in so many words. That was reductive, but you know what I mean. Like, can you actually can you argue with a person to the point where they change their mind? Can you actually do that with any? Like, is that what we're trying to do, or are you trying to do something else?
I think, okay, so we're at a comics event. We love comics here. So this is the kind of thing that it's obvious to us to the point where we don't pay enough respect to this. One of the unique powers of comics is our ability to put ourselves in other characters' shoes, in their experiences, in their way of life. But it's basically where March mostly exists outside of comics land, and actually getting to see the successful application of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, forcing yourself to look around our world through someone else's set of eyes, developing empathy. These strengths of comics, I was only able to really see with new eyes thanks to March going far outside of comics land. And I think that one reason why it has managed to humanize, revitalize this story of our shared history is specifically from that ability, but not just from folks involved within the movement, but in certain moments in which you are forced, whether through a flip of the camera, the reader is forced to perpetuate an act of violence against someone, or you're forced to sort of project the experiences of your own family or the people around you into these strangers who are depicted within the pages of the book. I don't think that has to be argumentative at all in order to do what is at the root of your question. I kind of don't think arguing works, but I do see that this, as a unique strength of comics, has worked in this specific situation, and this is one of the things that makes comics fantastic.
So I publish my comics on social media and kind of push them out a bunch of different places. And, I get a lot of likes and great jobs, but I also get people who don't agree with what I'm saying and, use not nice words sometimes. But those are the ones that I really treasure the most because, that means you read it, right? You can't say you hated it if you didn't read it. And if even that got like a little kernel of, truth or whatever I was trying to say, then I think that there's a value in that. And can it change someone's mind? I don't know.
Yeah.
But maybe this comic and then another comic and then, an argument with someone else could change someone's mind.
I guess the thing that makes me change my mind the most is when I think that it's that I did it, that I'm the one who's decided to be good and do this good thing. So, like with stuff like the turtles, I tell people, hey, you can be a hero. I know you basically already think these animals are cute. Here's what to do if you come across them. I know that kind of limits my audience, but I get grumpy comments. But I also get people who say, hey, I found a baby bird in my backyard, and I knew exactly what to do, and I read your comic, and that really makes me feel like I've had a huge impact. So that helps, but it is hard to measure for sure.
Yeah.
I think they can change your mind a little bit, especially if you come from a side of not trying to change their mind, just like, hey, I'm giving you the facts and you can make up your mind or grow with those facts, and later on maybe you get to the same conclusion as me, or maybe you don't, but at least we were both informed. And back home with the comic, with the separatists, I did have a lot of comments like people like, I didn't know that happened. Did you know that? No. And at least I felt like, well, maybe you have your own opinions, but now we know what happened, and that's the important part.
Yeah. Speaking of grumpy comments, because there's a lot of those out there nowadays. We're dealing with some pretty heavy stuff across the board here. Do you ever find yourself struggling with the emotional toll of, everything? How do you go about combating that and keeping yourself sane, basically? So, start with Cagen. Yeah.
That's assuming that I am sane.
Yeah, I'm with you, man.
But I kind of relish in it a little bit. When I publish a comic and it makes me feel a little sick, even though I feel my stomach a little nervous, I know that I've done something good, and it usually gets the most reactions and stuff online. So I relish in it.
I think I kind of started this whole process of teaching myself politics because I was so out of that bubble. And when I started, and then I was depressed every day. It's like reading the news and it's like, oh my God, this is too much. So what I usually do is I have a chat with other friends who are really into the news, so I chat with them all the time. And I can't believe this happened. And then with my family, I'm like, everything's fine. We're okay. Everything's gonna be great. Let's watch TV. And then I just text furiously at my friends. And the comics have been a way to express that too. Like if I'm angry about something, then it'll be in the comic, like whatever our governor is doing at that moment. And if I made a comic about it, well then I released it at least, and then I keep chatting with my friends about how angry I am.
Yeah, right after the election, I immediately went into therapy, just to kind of get my head, sorted out. So mental health, self-care is really important. I think that I strongly believe in limiting what you're exposed to, if that makes sense. So, I read the news, but if I read the news constantly, it would be really hard. I go for a lot of walks, and I try to maintain perspective. I also have a little piece of paper where I wrote things like, other people are working on these problems, which when you're working alone at home, it can kind of give you like this awful impression that you're the only one who cares and everyone is mean and like, you know, you have to save whatever, and that's completely untrue. You know, there are millions of incredible people working on stuff. So I do that. I also volunteer half a day a week at a climate nonprofit. They're like the most happy, upbeat people I've ever met. I don't know how they do it, and I hang out with them, and they help too. And I like pat my birds and you know, take breaks.
I might ask you for one of those pieces of paper later. It's pretty good.
I think that is a very good point in terms of millions of people fighting battles that overlap with each other. Particularly, I guess my general approach to political and social issues comes from growing up through punk. And that combined with being somebody who's in their early 20s, as early 20-somethings, most of us are sort of consumed by this idea that, you know, everything matters all the time and it matters with equal weight. And so there are a lot of kind of embarrassing lyrics even made by folks in their 20s, which are important lyrics, but basically it's like, if we're not going to do this, then we might as well die. Do this or nothing's ever going to matter. And that's true, but simultaneously, at a certain point, you have to actually grow into a big intent kind of situation where you realize you have these battles to fight for and against all the time. But yeah, particularly to just wind this into the last 2 years, you have to, especially in which 95% of all of our trust in society has been completely destroyed. So it takes a lot of conscious effort to actually trust that strangers, millions and millions of strangers, care about the same things that you do. And when people say things like, pick your battles, dude, like it's a real thing. Actually pick your battles. But you can only do that comfortably trusting that other people are going to pick the other battles that you care about too, and not pick the battles that you have chosen to embark upon. You have to see yourself as part of 10 million, 100 million people. That helps a lot. And the other main thing is, I think going back to what you were saying, kind of in terms of like the way mundane life works, the way family interactions and structure work, I've found that as long as I have enough space to like do the dishes and do laundry, and as long as I have space to be a dad and not let my apocalyptic vision of our society, you know, get into my like bad dad attitude towards my kids, like it just requires enough mindfulness that you can keep the normal stuff that has to be done. And I feel like that opens up so much space where you're like, oh right, this doesn't have, it's like a poison that takes over every part of your life. And I think that goes back to that early 20-somethings idea where everything matters of equal weight all the time. But now we are older and we're able to compartmentalize in a good way so we can function, we can fight, and we can also like make our kids macaroni and cheese.
It's important. Cool. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to open it up to any questions if anybody in the audience has any for anybody on the panel. Anybody? Yep.
It's not exactly a question, but it's more a comment on what you were saying about can be effective. And just my own experience of having worked on a comic, part of a series, Genome Comics, and the first one is around teen dating violence prevention. And what I found now that we're presenting it is that parents who feel that they've taught their kids this stuff, then when they show them the comic, the response is they're shocked because the kids are getting it in a different way than they were from the didactic, you know, what the parents or what they was presented in school. And I think part of it is the story, the artwork, you know, creating a world which the kids enter. And so I guess that's about communicating, it's about teaching, and you know, some of these issues that are just so huge around race and race relations, or oh my gosh, climate change and how we're living and so forth. It hadn't occurred to me, but you know, maybe really is a medium that could bring something new to the dialogue if we can connect somehow, guerrilla marketing, get it out there to more than the people who are so excited about comics in the school.
Yeah. Great. Over here.
First of all, thank you all for your thoughts and your work on this community non-community comics area, and then to make comics that have some affect and change in the art. My question is, if you could collaborate on mini comic with someone on the panel with you right now.
It's real truthful hours. Let's go. Yeah.
I'm just going to take the approach that I think each one of you panelists are working on really interesting comics, and I would like to work with all.
It's okay to say you don't want to collab with the person who draws turtles.
No, I was just thinking an environmental change comic. That's necessary. I need to do one of those.
You guys are all brilliant. I don't know. Yeah.
Stop it there.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you maintain focus on where to put your energy, especially when there are so many battles to be fought, and sometimes it might feel like, I want to focus on, say, environmentalism, but also, hey, there's these other issues about, something about, I'll say healthcare, versus healthcare, but just there's so much else to potentially branch into. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how you can be able to maintain a focus, if you even want to.
I think this is where you get into the actual nuts and bolts of the time and labor that go into making a comic. Comics is my full-time living, but basically the last year and a half or year has been this problem over and over again. I have 2 unfinished comics that would barely take any time to do, but they are not necessarily the comics that can allow me to get groceries until I get up to the proper clip of making the comic so that that's actually happening. I have a 3/4 finished comic about consumer style signposts of fascism and its incoming acceptance, where I just cannot whittle out the time to make it work, and it's frustrating because I started it in the springtime, and then I don't know, a lot of stuff that's hyper topical. You feel like if it came out tomorrow, it would still be too late. The new book that I'm doing it's like a shorter comics essay about raising kids in an era of necessary protest, and I started it a year ago, and it's only 100 pages, but because I'm so backed up with the other work that I have to finish to get a check. It's that same kind of thing where I'm like, this could be one of the most important things I put out into the world, but I was like, I can't free up the time to make it happen, and even if I finished it tomorrow, I don't know what the world is going to look like in 4 months when that book comes out, or in 2 months even. The world's changing so fast that yes, it's really hard to just have faith that finishing a project is more important ultimately than realizing where you need to go next. That's one of the downsides I think of comics taking so much time to make.
Yeah.
I think I did a comic for mice about the hurricane. It's at our table. And and I started the script, and I was ranting for an hour about La Junta and the Promesa law and stuff. And after I'd written a whole thing, I went to my girlfriend Carla and I said, I think it's getting dense. I don't know why. And she was like, what does any of this have to do about the hurricane? It's like, oh my God, yes, of course, we're focusing on the hurricane. So that's kind of how you pick. I'm like, I can be so angry about all the other things, and then I start writing, and it's like, wait. People this doesn't have to do anything with anything, so I had to delete everything and then start all over. I'm a bit more focused on one theme.
Yeah, I find it's really hard to make like a rambling comic. Like you have to kind of, you only have so many panels and you can get like 2 sentences in each panel, right? So you have to kind of like, you can't make everything about everything, which is, I think, very instructive.
Yeah, thank goodness for editors.
Yeah.
You guys know how to really focus on it too.
Any other questions? We probably got time for one more. Right there.
Sort of a comment in terms of like the perspective of creating a perhaps I often use comics to use people's activist software so the things that I don't understand because I find it very digestible and easy to follow much more pockets or abilities. Some of the others are effective in terms of I really appreciate people who don't quite get to see it.
You want to or
Oh,
you had a question?
I do have a question for the panel.
Yep.
Do you have a story about a time that a comic changed your minds?
Yes. Okay. 1990. I was 12. So X-Men and thrash metal basically gave me a social conscience. Anthrax specifically. But in 7th grade, there was a New Mutants issue that Ann Nocenti wrote, that I think Bill Sienkiewicz drew. And in it, basically it was a bullying story involving a neighboring school, maybe where like the Hellfire Club kids went to school, whatever. Anyway, there was a mutant who was bullied and harassed, ultimately wound up killing themselves, and Kitty Pryde had to deliver a eulogy for that kid at the kid's school. And so the last 2 pages were this eulogy. And as a 12-year-old, thanks to X-Men and thanks to Anthrax, I finally was able to perceive the dimensions of my world in this new, expansive way, and understand new dimensions like racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia. But I was so moved by this eulogy and the way that Kitty Pryde was laying out this interwoven oppression, interwoven words and actions that slowly whittle away at humanity. Then my parents were at the kitchen table at night, and in a very dramatic 7th grade fashion, went up to them and just read the eulogy, and did like a 1990 version of a mic drop. And I forgot all about it, but I remember the comic. But a few years ago, my parents were like, "Oh yeah, that really made a big impact on us." They're like, "Yeah, once you were done, we were like, that was in a comic? There must be something to these." That was the comic that kind of opened my parents' minds to the possibilities contained within comics, in addition to changing my own perception of the world around me.
That changed my mind about if you can change people's minds.
March was a big influence on, definitely not on my turtles, but on the way I think about it and the sort of sanitized vision that we get of that history. And I grew up in Canada, so I was even one step removed from it. And I was even a kid who was really interested in it. When I was in 5th grade, my dad said, "Do an interest talk on the Montgomery bus boycott." And I was like, "What is that?" And he's like, "I'm not going to tell you." And I was like, so I learned about it, but it really helped me see the multi-dimensional way that activism actually works in practice and the different arguments. And yeah, it was brilliant. So thanks.
Cool. I think we are out of. Oh, you got something? Okay. You have one? I don't want to step in. Okay.
Well, I think the big thing for me was when I started reading the Boondocks, I kind of opened my eyes to the fact that comics could be about serious issues and you could use humor. I mean, before that, I was reading Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes and more silly, fun stuff. But Boondocks really opened my eyes how comics could be used for social justice.
Boondocks is very good.
That's great.
Yeah. Cool. So we're out of time. Just want to give a round of applause to everyone who spoke. If you guys can very quickly tell everybody where they can find you at the con and what table you're at, etc.
I'm in the Hernandez room at table 113.
I'm in the Eisner room on table 132.
Cool.
Where am I? I'm out in the hall, just right out here.
Right on.
I'm also down in the Eisner room, 128 at the bottom of the stairs.
Thanks again, everybody. Thanks for coming.